record of working together, Democrats and Republicans, to solve big national challenges. Recently, we helped more Americans save for a dignified retirement. We cut taxes for families and small businesses. We updated the Medicare guarantee with the Chronic Care Act. We made progress on helping Americans get mental health care when they need it. And we passed a historic Families First Act with groundbreaking new policies to promote kinship care. I strongly believe the next opportunity for a big bipartisan initiative is affordable housing. Few things unite Americans quite like the feeling that the rent's too damn high or that saving for a down payment is a pipe dream. This is an issue in all 50 states, in big urban downtowns, medium-sized cities, and the suburbs, even in smaller communities and rural areas. Let's look at what 5 years of rent increases have done in a handful of cities relevant to this committee. In my hometown of Portland, data from Zillow shows the average monthly rent jumped by $335, nearly 23%. Charlotte, North Carolina, a $558 increase, or 46%. Memphis, Tennessee, a $428 increase, or nearly 50%. Boise, Idaho, a $639 increase, sending monthly rates 57% higher. The outlook isn't much better for people looking to buy a home, particularly young people looking to buy a first home. According to a new report from the National Association of Realtors, the share of sales going to first-time home buyers fell last year to the lowest level on record. And whether it's unaffordable rents or unattainable mortgages, oftentimes it is Black and Latino families who are hit the hardest. So, how should Congress go about solving this challenge? For a long time, you were pretty much breaking the rules if you said you had some supply-side ideas. Well, I want everybody to know I'm a supply-sider when it comes to housing, colleagues. We have got to create more housing supply. Now, for many years, Senator Cantwell has been the champion of the low-income housing tax credit, what's known as LIHTC. It is the most successful federal program for affordable housing that there is. The bill she and Senator Young have put forward, the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, would expand LIHTC to create 2 million new units nationwide. Yesterday, Senator Cardin and Senator Young introduced the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act, which is all about giving a private investment boost for housing in blighted and struggling neighborhoods that need it most. I am pleased to be a co-sponsor of both of their bills. They're both priorities that we include in a comprehensive bill I've offered called the DASH Act, the Decent, Affordable, Safe Housing for All Act. I am reintroducing DASH today. Another component of DASH is what I have named the middle income housing tax credit. So we would have LIHTC in America, but for firefighters and nurses and teachers and all these hard-hit middle income folks, we'd have MITEC. And I've heard so often at home, particularly in Portland and Bend, but all around the state, how important middle income housing is. America has fallen behind in building housing for decades, and the housing shortage has extended into the middle class. So I want to see middle income housing supplement low income housing, what's known as LIHTC. If a given state housing agency wants to use its MITEC credits for low income housing, my bill says it could plow all those resources into LIHTC. And I'd just like to say, colleagues, and we're going to be talking, I think, a lot about this, it's my view that in 2023, providing the states with this kind of flexibility is absolutely essential to increasing housing supply where it is needed most. You can't talk now about housing without addressing homelessness, a priority in the DASH Act. It's clear that those experiencing homelessness need more help than they're getting. Furthermore, building more affordable housing today is going to reduce homelessness tomorrow, which would prevent a lot of individual suffering and save taxpayers' dollars. I know we're also going to talk about the importance to keep pushing state and local authorities to cut back on the thicket of zoning rules that get in the way of building the housing that is so essential. This is another area, and Senator Crapo and I have talked about essentially all these areas where there's an opportunity for bipartisan agreement in the tradition of those several bills that I talked about in my opening statement. These restrictive zoning laws can hurt local economies, and what is even worse, they often amount to a backdoor method of segregation. So there's lots for the committee to talk about today. My view is, along with mental health care, rural health, and a number of other topics, affordable housing is one of the areas where this committee, as has been our tradition, can come together in a bipartisan way and make real progress. Senator Crapo.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and you have well laid out the issue today. I appreciated not only your focus on this issue and supply-side solutions, but the fact that you recognized the bipartisan work that we do in this committee and identified this as one of the key areas where we ought to be able to accomplish similar solutions. When this committee held a hearing on housing last summer, we had just learned that the consumer price inflation had spiked to 9.1%, the highest in more than 40 years. The shelter component of the consumer price index was up 5.6% relative to a year earlier, and rents were up by nearly 6%. Unfortunately for renters and potential homeowners, the mislabeled Inflation Reduction Act did nothing to address inflation and rising costs, but is in fact projected to exacerbate inflation in the near term. As the Federal Reserve attempts to control price growth with interest rate hikes, mortgage rates have hit highs not seen since the 2008 financial crisis and are now hovering at 6.5%. Slowing investment in the housing market and pricing many buyers in Idaho and all across the country out of the market. January's overall consumer price inflation is still significantly above normal, hitting 6.4% annually. Shelter accounts for over half of the core increase, up to 7.9% over the last year. And inflation is also eating away at the value of wages. Real hourly earnings have declined 1.8%. Across the country, Americans are faced with unaffordable housing. Specifically, lower-income Americans are facing a shortage of about 7 million affordable homes, and the supply of affordable housing continues to fall short of demand, with the gap increasing every year. One tax tool used to address the supply shortage and incentivize builders to create affordable homes is the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit, or LIHTC. It is responsible for generating a majority of all affordable rental housing created in the United States today and generally enjoys bipartisan support in Congress. Several members of this committee have been working across the aisle to find affordable housing solutions. Senator Wyden has very well described those efforts. Again, these proposals include changes to LIHTC and new tax incentives. Senators Young and Cantwell, as well as several other members, are working to reintroduce the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, which would bolster LIHTC for developing and preserving affordable housing. Senators Young and Cardin introduced the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act, which would create a federal tax credit to finance home building and rehabilitation in urban and rural neighborhoods. Other finance members have expressed interest in addressing the affordable housing supply shortage, including one of our newest members, Senator Blackburn. And obviously, as he indicated, our chair, Senator Wyden, has introduced the Decent, Affordable, Safe Housing for All, or DASH Act, which brings the concept of middle-income housing tax credits into play. I thank you all for your hard work. Targeted tax policies such as LIHTC are important and a part of solving housing affordability and supply issues. But we must also address the drivers that are raising the cost of housing generally. When input and regulatory costs are high, LIHTC is less effective. Zoning laws and regulatory barriers are often uncoordinated, unnecessary, or overly cumbersome, and can ultimately work against the goal of providing affordable housing by creating excessive development costs. States and localities with the most restrictive zoning laws and regulatory barriers often have the most severe shortages in affordable housing as a result. Federal and state and local leaders must work together to reduce regulatory barriers, and they should look to success stories around the country. In Houston, local leaders reduced the minimum lot size from 5,000 to 1,400 square feet. After initial success, the reform was expanded to cover the entire city. Due in part to the ability for small lot construction, Houston's median house price is below the national median. Further, it is estimated the average Houston household benefited from this reform by roughly $18,000. In order to make it economically viable to build across price points in the market, these supply-side factors need to be addressed. Overall tax costs, regulations, supply chain bottlenecks, and financing expenses all enter into investment decisions. Overall, there is no better cure to housing affordability than a healthy, thriving economy. The pro-growth policies in the Republicans' 27 tax reform led to one of the strongest economies in decades. Low unemployment, a low poverty rate, strong wage growth, high median incomes, increased investment, and record federal tax revenues. We should preserve those policies and explore additional opportunities to promote growth, increase investment, and encourage research and development in the United States. I look forward to discussing with today's witnesses ways to ensure that affordable housing is accessible and that the American dream of homeownership remains attainable. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Crapo, and I especially appreciate the fact that as we get out of the gate in this new Congress on housing, that we've got a lot of opportunities to bring the committee together in our longtime tradition. Let me introduce our witnesses. Our first witness will be Ms. Denise Scott. She's president of Local Initiative Support Corporation, where she heads investments nationwide with over 3 decades of experience in community development. She's also a member of the board of directors of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and has taught at Columbia University. Next, I'm pleased that we've got our colleague from Washington, who, as I've noted, has been a long-time advocate of these crucial issues, and she's going to introduce our next witness, Steve Walker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank you and Senator Crapo for having this important hearing and for all the work last year that we engaged in conversations both on chips and science and year-end packages to try to get the low-income housing tax credit addressed, and look forward to working with you this year. We're here today to listen to Steve Walker, who's the Executive Director of the Washington State Housing Finance Commission. And he has been working on affordable housing projects for 30 years. In 1996, he joined the Washington Housing Finance Commission and oversaw the financing of affordable apartments and projects for families, and has become their executive director in 2019. As you both mentioned, the shortage of 7 million rental homes nationwide are extremely important for low-income renters. And last week, the Washington State Department of Commerce reported that our state will need to add 1.1 million homes over the next 20 years, and more than half of those must be affordable for residents at the lowest income levels to meet our population growth. I can't tell you how astounding that is just to hear, because we already know in Washington that we need an incredible investment in workforce housing. I think, if anything, our committee could add to the challenges that our economy faces in making sure that we have workforce housing and to make sure that people can afford to live where the jobs are. And that is, whether that's part of the efforts in the expansion of chips and science or just in general as our economy returns. So together, you mentioned our colleagues, Senators Young and Blackburn, and myself continuing to work on this legislation. I look forward to working with both of you. But Mr. Steve Walker will address the low-income housing tax credit, tax-exempt private activity housing bonds, and how they've played a crucial role in providing housing to millions of families. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Cantwell, and you're spot on about the urgency of this workforce issue. I was home for town meetings recently, got some more coming up this weekend. And when I walked into a room where I expected a host of kind of economic issues I'd heard before. I was told by school officials that school districts are having to actually buy houses so they can make them available to their teachers. So the urgency that you have stressed is spot on. We're very pleased that the committee is going to be joined by Sharon Gino, president of the National Multifamily Housing Council. She also brings an extensive background from 3 decades working in various areas of housing law. She also teaches courses on housing law at George Washington and at Georgetown. Next is Mark Calabria. He's a senior advisor at the Cato Institute. He served as the director of the Federal Housing Finance Agency, as chief economist of Vice President Pence, and as an aide to the Banking Committee here in the Senate. Garrett Watson is a senior policy analyst and modeling manager at the Tax Foundation, where he conducts research on federal and state tax policy. Ms. Scott, we're glad you're here, and we'll begin with your testimony.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here. Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Crapo and members of the committee, I'm honored to join you this morning to discuss the urgent need to expand our nation's affordable housing supply and the measures this committee must take to address the housing crisis. My name is Denise Scott, as you heard, and I work for LIST, one of the largest nonprofit housing community development organizations in the country, and we're also a certified CDFI. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for joining Senator Warner in founding the Senate's Community Development Finance Caucus. LISC has offices in over 38 urban markets stretching from Richmond to Toledo, Houston, and Seattle. And we also have a rural program reaching 2,000 rural counties in 49 states and including Puerto Rico. If there is one unifying truth across all these markets, it's that the lack of housing supply is hampering the ability of families of modest means to achieve financial stability. Nearly half of all renters are cost burdened, meaning that rent eats up at least 30% of their monthly income, and 1 in 4 renters pays more than 50% of their income in rent, leaving little money available each month for groceries, medicine, childcare, and basic other necessities. And it's not just the lowest income populations that are struggling, as you have heard, although they are feeling the greatest pain. We are also hearing from municipalities around the country that they're having difficulty housing teachers and firefighters and healthcare workers. And we know that an inadequate supply of quality, affordable housing in many rural communities is hampering their ability to attract employers. In addition, historic home prices since the pandemic have combined with high interest rates and limited supply to keep homeownership out of reach for far too many families. This is effectively shutting down the main path to wealth across generations, particularly households of color. The good news is that this committee has under its jurisdiction powerful tools to address the housing crisis, and there is bipartisan support to do so. First and foremost, the committee can enhance the low-income housing tax credit program. The housing credit is the nation's most successful tool. It has been responsible for the production of most of the affordable housing, and more than 50% of the households in tax credit properties are extremely low-income families. Congress could spur the creation of over 2 million more rental units over the next decade by restoring the 12.5% increase to the formula for the allocated tax credits, and an increase that was enacted through bipartisan legislation in 2018, but it expired in 2021. And also enacting the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, again bipartisan legislation, last session by Senators Cantwell and Young. As detailed in my testimony, the committee could consider other measures to improve the program that emphasize long-term preservation of affordability, including the qualified contract and the right of first refusal provisions. In addition, Congress can pass the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act, which would create 500,000 new homes over the next decade. This bipartisan legislation, just introduced by Senators Cardin and Young, would attract private capital to support investments in single-family homes in rural and urban communities suffering from displacement and high vacancies. In these communities, the cost of developing and rehabilitating homes often exceeds the value of the home. The Neighborhood Homes Tax Credit fills the gap between the cost of construction and the value value of the property. It would therefore fill a void in our affordable housing tax financing ecosystem, providing an effective and necessary tool for revitalizing and repopulating communities while also providing affordable homeownership opportunities for first-time, first-generation home buyers. In closing, there is a supply gap of approximately 3.8 million homes in this country, more depending upon how you count, and this gap is only likely to grow in the near term in light of high interest rates and the spike in the cost of construction. Enacting both the Housing Credit Improvement Act and neighborhood homes will spur the production of 2.5 million housing units over the next decade, cutting into a sizable portion of that supply gap and getting us much closer to ensuring that all families in this country are able to enjoy the health, well-being, and financial security that an affordable home provides. We just need Congress to act and to act quickly. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Ms. Scott. Mr. Walker from the Northwest.
Good morning. Thank you for convening this hearing, Chairman Wyden, Ranking Member Crapo, and thank you, Senator Cantwell, for your years of steadfast leadership in affordable housing. It's an honor to be here. My name is Steve Walker. I currently have the privilege of serving as the Executive Director of the Washington State Housing Finance Commission. I am a public servant with the charge of meeting my state's affordable housing challenges. And our number one challenge is the lack of enough decent, affordable apartments that low-income folks can reasonably afford. My peers, the officials who run their own state housing finance agencies, would say the same thing. The Housing Credit Program is our nation's most effective tool. It's not the only tool, but it is the most effective tool for this challenge, building affordable housing. And the truth is that the private sector simply cannot and does not produce apartments at rents that low-income folks can afford. Low-income folks include people like baristas and warehouse workers, bank tellers, teachers, and retired seniors. In Washington State, as in many others, the shortage of housing has caused rents to rise so far out of proportion to incomes that thousands of families, especially families of color, are being pushed further and further away from their jobs and from their communities in search of affordable rents. Rents take up a larger and larger part of the household budget. Those who are struggling can easily fall into homelessness, and they do at rates that we have not ever seen before. Yet the majority of apartments coming online today, almost anywhere you look, are only affordable to the top of the market. Simply providing rental vouchers, as some have suggested, would do nothing to change this dynamic. We need to produce affordable housing, and that's what the housing credit does. In fact, the credit is the only federal program that makes it economically feasible for developers to do that. It made possible 3.7 million apartments for low-income households across the U.S., 130,000 in Washington State alone. As in other states, you will find these homes in urban, suburban, and rural neighborhoods in every part of Washington. They include family-sized apartments in our agricultural Yakima Valley, studio apartments in downtown Seattle and in Spokane, senior buildings with health care clinics on site, and family buildings with child care on site. Many of you have seen these successes with your own eyes and have met residents who share how having a safe, affordable apartment has changed their lives. That is why the housing credit has earned so much support in Congress for nearly 40 years, because members clearly see the benefit to their states and to their districts from this highly effective, proven tool. Literally hundreds of Democrats and Republicans in both chambers have co-sponsored bills to expand and strengthen the program, 252 members in the last Congress alone. Because the housing credit is working, we simply need more of it. Unfortunately, in the last few years, we've gone the other way, for example, letting the temporary increase to the credit lapse. The good news is that Senator Cantwell from my state, along with Senator Young, Senator Blackburn, and Chairman Wyden, are poised to reintroduce the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act. Co-sponsoring this bill is the single most important thing each member of this committee and every member of the Senate can do to support affordable housing in your state. I ask that you support complementary legislation. Chairman Wyden, Senator Cortez Masto, Senators Cardin and Young, which have introduced legislation that would support both affordable rental housing and affordable home ownership. Because safe, affordable housing is the most important foundation that families and communities can have, I urge you to support the Affordable Housing Credit and ensure that all communities throughout our country can build this foundation. Thank you for this opportunity to testify.
Thank you very much. Next is Ms. Gino.
Chairman Wyden, Ranking Member Crapo, and members of the committee. Thank you for the privilege of testifying on behalf of the National Multifamily Housing Council and the National Apartment Association. My name is Sharon Gino, and I'm the president of NMHC. For more than 30 years, NMHC and NAA have partnered to provide a single voice for the American apartment industry that provides apartment homes for 38.9 million Americans, accounting for almost 1/3 of the U.S. housing stock, and contributes $3.4 trillion of economic value to our economy annually. America is facing a housing affordability crisis without a doubt. While challenges differ from community to community, many families, seniors, and people with disabilities are unable to rent homes due to increased costs driven by a lack of supply, barriers to development, and regulatory burdens. The total share of cost-burdened households, those paying more than 30% of their income, has increased dramatically over the last several years as wages have not kept pace with cost, while others are priced out of communities altogether. Put simply, we have a housing supply shortage, and while it has taken decades to get to this point, it will take time to reverse. We must begin addressing this issue today. NMHC and NAA estimate that the U.S. needs to build 4.3 million more apartment homes by 2035 to make up for decades-long underbuilding, to meet future demand, and avoid increasing expensive housing. We have kicked the can down the road long enough. We urge you to act on a variety of legislative proposals that will generate needed housing resources for Americans of today and tomorrow. The apartment industry stands ready to help meet the rising need for attainably priced rental housing, but we cannot do it alone. It requires strong partnership between the public and the private sectors. There is no magic silver bullet here, but a multifaceted approach can be effective in easing current market conditions.
Okay.
On the tax policy front, we strongly recommend passage of the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act of 2021, as this bipartisan bill would increase the availability of low-income housing tax credits to develop more than 2 million homes, and would help across the U.S. in rural, urban, and suburban communities. In addition to the acute need for low-income housing, affordability also threatens the middle-income tier, including teachers, firefighters, nurses, and police officers. That group has an increasing percentage of folks that are cost-burdened, right now up to 26% of that population. We urge Congress to finance additional 344,000 affordable homes by enacting Chairman Wyden's proposed middle-income housing tax credit, which builds off the success of the low-income housing tax credit. Additionally, NMHC and NAA support proposals that would build on Senator Tim Scott's Opportunity Zone proposals, as well as Senator Stabenow and Brown's legislation to encourage adaptive reuse of underutilized commercial space. While tax laws would help spur development and preservation of affordable housing, we must also deliver short-term solutions and enhance the need for residents that are struggling. This includes increasing the supply of Section 8 housing choice vouchers, as well as other supports for families in need. Regulatory obstacles at all levels of government also prevent us from delivering housing our country so desperately needs. NIMBYism and antiquated and discriminatory zoning laws make it difficult for developers to develop in many communities across the country, thereby impeding our ability to increase the supply. There are a number of proposals to cut some of the regulatory tape in the administration's recently announced Housing Supply Action Plan issued last May. These efforts, among other things, would reward jurisdictions that have reformed zoning and land use policies with higher scores in certain federal grant processes, and deploy new financing mechanisms to build and preserve more housing where financing gaps currently exist. Access to stable, quality housing in communities of choice has been proven time and time again to be critical to achieving economic stability, positive health outcomes, education attainment, good nutrition, and other indicators. For that reason, it has always been a bipartisan issue. For the sake of the residents who live in rental housing today and those that don't have access to it, we urge you to work across the aisle with urgency to enact these proposals and others described in our testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to hearing the committee's questions.
Thank you for finishing with urgency, because that's what we're trying to convey. Mr. Calabria, Dr. Calabria.
Thank you. Chairman Wyden, Ranking Member Crapo, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the invitation to appear at today's hearing. Too many working families face significant housing cost burdens. Dramatic increase in mortgage rates, along with inflation and building and materials costs, have created historic price pressures. Let me also say, while I come from a banking committee background, I've always been impressed with the Finance Committee's commitment to housing. I will note we have the unique advantage of the chair and ranking member of banking are also members of finance, so perhaps we can not only have something bipartisan, but by committee working across housing issues. I think this is particularly important because the development of assisted housing has become so overly complex with multiple layers of subsidies, different rules, different application cycles. For instance, most tax credit properties developments are often used in conjunction with non-tax subsidies such as those at home or CDBG. Considerable expenses incurred coordinating, combining these various subsidies. Perhaps you could like to think about it this way. I'm suggesting we put a few lawyers out of work and maybe streamline some of these programs so we can actually deliver those benefits to the renters themselves. So I would really encourage any changes to the tax credit to be coordinated with other housing programs under the jurisdiction of the Banking Committee, particularly Section 8, which is widely used by tax credit renters. I would also urge the committee to take a broader perspective of where we may be in the multifamily construction cycle. To quote a recent Freddie Mac report, multifamily is at an inflection point. The bulk of evidence suggests that the national rental market has been softening, and we may be entering an actual oversupply of multifamily. I do want to emphasize an oversupply at these price points, not a structural oversupply, but more a cyclical oversupply. And while, of course, forecasting is always difficult, most indicators suggest that rents would decline over the next 12 to 18 months. So I would just urge some cautiousness to thinking about adding stimulus to additional construction at a time when we are likely passing the peak of this cycle. The primary drivers, of course, of housing costs nationally are land costs, labor costs, material costs. And I would really urge Congress, perhaps out of the jurisdiction of this committee, but one area where Congress can make a really big difference is to convert federally held land into land that could be used to develop housing. I would urge members to take a look at the model that's been used in Nevada. Las Vegas would be considerably more expensive if we didn't have former Senator Reid to thank for helping convert federal lands to developed lands. Again, outside the jurisdiction of this committee, but an important ability to add supply to the marketplace. A little bit back to this jurisdiction of the committee, I think we can make a big difference in material costs if we can make some differences and resolve some of our trade disputes, particularly with Canadian lumber and aluminum. And while I would mostly recommend caution at this point in the cycle, if the committee were to revisit the legislative framework for the tax credit, I would make the following recommendations. First, I would make the tax credit look a little bit more like the HUD's home program. The purposes for this is home offers a wide variety of uses. It can pay for security deposits, it can pay for rental assistance, and really keeping in mind that while we do have a national housing crisis, every market is different. And to me, the more flexibility we can have for local market conditions, the better in terms of meeting needs on the ground. And so, that's just an important consideration from my perspective. I also want to first commend a number of state housing finance agencies that go above and beyond the federal income targeting requirements in the tax credit But my view is I think we can make additional success in helping prioritize that those families most in need. And while, of course, there are rental burdens across the income spectrum, those at the bottom are so severely out of line with those in the middle of the top. I would urge the committee, for instance, to consider the addition of a sub-goal of having a certain percent of units going to households under 30% of area median income. As one of the Banking Committee staff, to add a different note, as one of the Banking Committee staff responsible for drafting and negotiating the 2000 Reauthorization of Violence Against Women Act, I do want to be very clear that I'm disappointed in Treasury's slow movement in meeting its obligations under VAWA in response to the tax credit properties. Let me also say there are a large number of rental units outside of the footprint of the tax credit, and we have a large number of vacant properties. So one of the things I would lastly suggest is let's ask about how we get all of these small properties. Half of renters live in units and properties under 5 units. How do we start bringing them into the cycle? And one thing I would suggest is we directly allow, say, the first 500 in monthly rent to be tax-free, so is to encourage those subsidies beyond the traditional tax credit higher density properties. Again, I thank you for your time this morning and look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you. Mr. Watson.
Chairman Wyden, Ranking Member Crapo, distinguished members of the Senate Finance Committee, thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony on how to improve tax policy to increase affordable housing supply and serve working families. I'm Garrett Watson, Senior Policy Analyst at the Tax Foundation, where I focus on how we can improve our federal tax code. Today, I'll recommend ways to improve the low-income housing tax credit, known as LIHTC, to ensure it is effective at providing affordable housing to low-income Americans. I'll also discuss how broader improvements to the tax code, such as providing better cost recovery for residential structures, would be an effective way to grow the supply of affordable housing. We should consider 3 big picture points when evaluating the effectiveness of LIHTC as a tool to help working families and low-income households. First, while LIHTC has helped expand housing affordability, the credit's administration could be improved. More detailed information could be provided on the credit's effectiveness, as recommended in a 2018 report by the Government Accountability Office. Notably, GAO recommends that policymakers designate an agency to collect data to better understand project development costs. Such data would help inform future reform efforts, ensuring agencies impose limits on costs, root out fraud, and reform often opaque and discretionary credit allocation processes. The data we have so far, for example, shows that development supported by the credit can suffer from higher than average construction costs. A 2017 GAO study, for example, found that only 30% of allocating agencies at the state level put limits on development costs. That potentially undercuts the credit's efficiency. While the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development provides valuable project-level data, additional data, such as information on fees paid to developers and syndicators, as well as outcomes for properties and tenants over time, would be valuable for assessing LIHTC. Second, it's important to evaluate LIHTC's broader policy effectiveness before considering options to expand LIHTC. One area of concern is how much of LIHTC's benefit goes to low-income households. Several studies have found that between 1/3 and 3/4 of the subsidy provided by LIHTC does go to low-income households, while the rest accumulates to other stakeholders in the process, such as developers and investors. Similarly, LIHTC projects can tend to be located in higher poverty neighborhoods, which deprives tenants of the benefit of living in places with more opportunity and more amenities. Finally, many of LIHTC's administrative challenges are rooted in using the tax code to tackle important social problems that may be outside the proper scope of the tax system. The array of programs that we have supporting housing, ranging from federal grants, tax credits for historic rehabilitation, and tenant-facing assistance, all overlap with LIHTC, both in their policy goals and benefiting stakeholders. That overlap can make it harder to evaluate the effectiveness of the credit compared to alternatives, such as housing vouchers, an option considered by CBO and many others going back decades. In addition to reforms to LIHTC, a supplementary approach to expanding the supply of affordable housing is to reduce the tax burden of investment in housing. One way to reduce that tax burden is increasing or improving the cost recovery of structures in the federal tax code. Currently, investors in residential structures must depreciate those structures over periods up to 27.5 years, which limits the economic value of depreciation allowances. Ideally, all investments should be fully and immediately deducted from taxable income, but this can pose a challenge for structures that create a net operating loss given the large size of that investment. One solution is to provide neutral cost recovery, which adjusts depreciation deductions to maintain their value in real terms. This would improve the economic incentive to invest in structures, expand the housing supply, while also avoiding the challenges posed by fully expensing those types of investments. According to Tax Foundation's estimates, providing neutral cost recovery to residential structures could lead to the construction of up to 2.3 million additional housing units in the long run, lower construction costs by about 11%, and raise long-run economic output by 1.2%. Pairing better cost recovery with efforts to improve land use and zoning rules at the state and local levels, as has been already mentioned today, would magnify the positive effects of both LIHTC and neutral cost recovery. Reforming LIHTC and providing neutral cost recovery for residential structures are just two important steps that policymakers can take to ensure the federal tax code is not a barrier to solving America's affordable housing challenge. Thank you, and I look forward to answering any questions.
All right, thank you all. You all have been very helpful. Let me begin, if I might, and I'm going to ask this of you, Ms. Gino, because I was struck. Dr. Calabria says we're passing through a cycle. Basically, all you Congress folks shouldn't get too worked up because we're passing through a cycle. Now, I've had the honor to represent Oregon for a while in the United States Congress. I have never, in my time in public service, seen school districts having to buy houses to rent to their employees because the housing crunch is so serious. So I think it's kind of disconnected from the facts to say that we're passing out of a cycle. And I want to follow up on a point I heard you make, because your views, and particularly representing such a major business association, very valuable. I gather you think that the number of firefighters and middle-income people who are, I guess the technical housing jargon for it is cost-burdened, is increasing. And it is not increasing by a modest amount. It's increasing in a significant way. So can you sort this out? Because what you said sure doesn't seem to me like we're passing through a cycle. I think your comments reflect what I'm hearing at town hall meetings, what my colleagues are hearing, is that middle-income people, and I just hate the idea of a policy debate that would pit the needs of middle-income people against the needs of low-income people. My goodness, that's the last thing we need in America. We've got to get shelter to people who need it. So tell us your assessment of how serious the situation is for the missing middle, let's call it, refer to it that way.
Sure, no, I appreciate the question. And while I agree in part with my colleague, Dr. Calabria's assessment, there are parts of the real estate segment that are passing through a cycle, mostly on the higher end of the income scale. We are seeing a supply of housing that had been delayed due to COVID that will be coming on the market in 2023. We're already seeing rents start to come down in that segment as it's pushing down the line. But to your point, Senator, there simply isn't enough at that low and middle income level. We are not building for that component other than housing that is being supported by the low-income housing tax credit. And what happens often in this case, and I've operated this housing before, is as families start to have the opportunity to save a little bit because they've been supported through the low-income housing tax credit housing or some other subsidy, and they're moving up the economic scale, they get priced out of those markets. That happens to families that are taking advantage of job opportunities. It happens sometimes to veterans whose benefits just exceed that income level. It happens sometimes to seniors who may have a small pension from a prior job opportunity, but their pension has not kept pace with the cost of housing. So that group, there really is no support for. And the middle-income housing tax credit would truly provide an opportunity to create housing that is supported for that particular group of people.
So your judgment, again, is this question of being cost burdened is basically you can't afford to start becoming part of the American dream. I mean, the American dream has always been to work hard and play by the rules and get that first home and get started. And unless I'm missing something, your testimony indicates that that problem is getting more serious. It is more serious today than it was before. And yes, I'm sure that some people can still get housing, but I appreciate you're making the case for the missing middle, because based on what I hear, at home, so many people who work hard want to have a chance. It's one of the reasons we give the tax break again for your first home. They want to make a difference. One just question, if I might, very quickly, for you, Mr. Walker. The DASH Act closes some pretty serious loopholes, and we closed the qualified contract and right of first refusal loophole in order to protect low-income housing long-term. How important is that?
Well, I'll start by saying very important, and I appreciate you putting a bright light on it. The right of first refusal, both of these are long existing parts of the statute that was created in the mid-late 80s. And what we have seen, we've seen some bad behavior, some ambiguities in both the statute and some imprecise language in the partnership agreements. The right of first refusal, which was anticipated when there was a nonprofit partner alongside the investor owning and operating these properties, at year 15, the investor would quietly exit under a formula. And the behavior that we are seeing is that either that investor, or actually an investor that has stepped in the shoes of that investor getting close to that 15th year, are starting to really jam the exit strategy and trying to extract quite a bit of capital out of the deal. And the effect of that is either litigation, which is very expensive and jeopardizes both the nonprofit operator or the property itself, or simply having to acquiesce to those demands, which again jeopardizes the property and ultimately puts at risk the residents for whom the property is intended to be there.
My time is up, but obviously we're also concerned about it in the context of the trend of private equity firms acquiring housing and taking advantage of these loopholes. So I appreciate your response. Senator Crapo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Dr. Calabria, industry's decision to invest in new housing is accumulation of many factors that we've discussed today. Input costs, impact on the return of investment, along with rent and sales prices. Regulations, taxes, and financing are all components of the calculation. Dr. Calabria, how does the overall state of the economy impact the decision to invest, and how can Congress support housing affordability without contributing to inflationary pressures?
Thank you, Senator Crapo. That's a terrific question. And let me, emphasize to clarify from something Senator Wyden raised. Just because you may be in a cycle doesn't mean you don't do anything. It just means you may do something different to focus on. When we tend to see changes in the cycle, we tend to see shifts where income burdens, people lose their job, people suffer income losses, and so you may have a different style of support in a weaker economy than you would have in a booming economy. But I do think we need to be concerned about, since, go back to Econ 101, since the number one constraint structurally in the housing market is a lack of supply, we need to be cautious about adding demand subsidies that simply run up prices, which is how we've gotten the inflationary pressures we face today. So we need to be cautious about how do we think about this in an economic sense so that we're actually achieving our objectives.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Watson, as mentioned in your testimony, LIHTC is an important tax tool to encourage investment in affordable housing. However, as you noted, there are ways to improve this credit and its administration and oversight. Could you just give us a review of the specific recommendations you have to improve the credit's efficiency so that Congress should consider that in future LIHTC legislation?
Thank you, Senator, for that question. I think one major theme when looking at the credit's effectiveness is we really need to have a shared understanding of the baseline from the data of how the credit is doing and how it's actually connecting the credit with outcomes for low-income tenants and for folks who own those developments. And so I think we have a good base with what HUD is already collecting. There's a lot of great information there that's been leveraged in research and elsewhere. But we can really build on that, I think, by providing more granular data to be able to answer some of these questions about how the credit is doing and building on either reform efforts considered now or reforms in the future to ensure that we're maximizing the amount of benefit that's actually going to those tenants rather than all the folks who are in that process who are necessary, but we could be doing a better job of making passing through more efficiently.
Thank you. And Ms. Gino, Do you believe that addressing affordable housing supply requires pro-growth tax policies more generally, in addition to housing-specific initiatives? And if so, can you discuss some of the recent proposals before Congress that could actually negatively impact the supply of affordable housing in the tax arena?
Sure. So absolutely, the private market simply cannot afford to provide housing in the amounts that we need it in the lowest income tiers and also in the middle income tier. So those tax incentives are incredibly useful. I was looking at some recent data from HUD that $8 billion annually is generated from the low-income housing tax credit in budget authority. That is critically important to offsetting what the true cost of developing that housing is, and making it affordable for folks that need it.
And so are there tax policies that Congress is considering, or that you've seen proposed here in Congress that could actually undercut that?
Well, certainly anything that's going to adjust the tax rates will make a difference in both the use of the low-income housing tax credit. We saw a little bit of that happen when the tax rate was the corporate tax rate was adjusted downward. Now the market has made adjustments for that, but we're not seeing the full value of what the tax credit could be and could generate now as we had previously when the tax rates have dropped. So that is one issue that does impact the low-income housing tax credit.
All right, thank you. And finally, Mr. Walker, aside from the increases to LIHTC, are there any reforms to the program that would be helpful to you and fellow state housing authorities in administering the credit?
Thank you for that question. I think, stepping back and looking for opportunities to improve a 40-year-old program is always important to do, and Congress has done that a few times over the years. I think there's legislation speaking to the student rule to recognize that folks living in credit housing often need to go back to school or retool their skills, and so both HUD and the credit have two different definitions of the student rule. I think there's been testimony today about bringing things into alignment, but opening up that is an example of how we can improve the program. So I think there are opportunities to always look at doing that. Right now, because it's such a proven tool, I think the opportunity on the table is to make it the power tool that it needs to be.
Thank you. I see my time's up.
Tools and power tools. Okay, thank you. Senator Stabenow.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. Such an important topic. I was not long ago up in Traverse City, Michigan, meeting with 15 different chambers of commerce all across northern Michigan, #1 priority housing, and for so many reasons. I mean, we can see this whether it's in Detroit or northern Michigan or any part of our state, certainly. I do have a question, Ms. Gino, that relates to sort of where we are going after the pandemic as it relates to remote work, because on top of everything else, we are seeing certainly different ways in which people want to work, which creates challenges of underutilized office buildings, but also opportunities to convert some of those buildings to residential, as you know, and create more housing. And so to capitalize on this, and I appreciate your mentioning our bill, the Revitalizing Downtowns Act would create a tax credit to help convert commercial buildings into affordable housing and mixed-use properties. So I know that your Housing Council recently released an in-depth report on the feasibility of converting commercial real estate to multifamily, and that you detail many of the challenges of that. So I wonder if you might describe some of the biggest obstacles to doing that, and also speak to how tax policy could address some of these obstacles and how we can capitalize on the opportunity to create more affordable housing through this process.
Sure, thank you for that question. The National Multifamily Housing Council, in partnership with the Urban Land Institute, as you mentioned, recently issued a study, and it's really a case study report on different ways that developers have been able to convert office properties to multifamily residential. There is opportunity to do that. The challenges include, in some cases, zoning, in some cases, just the way the buildings are constructed. A lot of office building is not constructed for residential use. Therefore, the costs of doing those conversions, while could be critically important to the revitalization of communities and revitalizations of downtown, it may be cost prohibitive to do so. That's why the tax incentive is so very important. This is not just about creating housing, which is a really important component of it. It's also about revitalizing communities that are going to need that economic support. Our organization at NAA look very forward to working with you and your staff. We think there's some opportunities to even expand and grow that, ensuring that REITs can use those tax incentives, ensuring that shopping malls and other retail uses can be converted, and other opportunities. So we look forward to working with you.
Well, thank you so much. And we really are at a point where we need to be leaning in on all of these changes and creating opportunities, whether it's big cities or small towns. I mean, we really need to be doing that. And I look forward, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, to working on this particular policy of how we do this kind of conversion. And then quickly to Ms. Scott, I think it's so important we're talking about the low-income housing tax credit and the fact that it's produced over 4 million affordable housing units and housed 8 million low-income families. I wonder if you might talk a little bit more about the connection, not only of housing, but the connection between housing and jobs, and what access to affordable housing means to families and their ability to find and maintain a job.
Thank you, Senator, for that question. I think this is a very important issue, and I would approach it from two angles. First of all, that the stable housing provides for families the opportunity to achieve tenure in jobs that they have. Many employers are telling us that they're having difficulty maintaining a workforce that's housed unstably, that people have to move around frequently, and so they're unable to move up in the jobs that they have. Another side of the job issue is that the housing production actually creates jobs, both short-term and long-term jobs, and that the numbers are something we could give you to share with you, but it's substantial in terms of the volume of activity that housing production produces. So it's both the individual family that benefits, but it's also the broader economy that is benefiting from the production of housing.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Stabenow. Senator Grassley is next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to start out with Ms. Gino. At my request, the Government Accountability Office issued 2 reports on low-income housing tax credit. Their report found there is a minimal federal oversight of the program and a lack of quality data. As a result, it was difficult to evaluate efficiency and effectiveness of the program. To address this, Government Accountability Office recommended designating HUD to assist IRS in oversight of the program and to collect project cost data. Would you support HUD being designated as a joint administrator of the program? And if not, what would you recommend to be done to increase federal oversight and ensure data collection necessary to evaluate the program?
Thank you for that question. I believe a lot of data is actually already collected, but it's collected, to your point, at the state level with the state housing finance agencies. There isn't a centralized funnel on all of it for the federal government to take a look at it. I would suggest continuing to work with those state agencies in partnership with them to be sure that those data points are collected at the federal level, either through the service and or through HUD. The data that HUD has collected, I think, has been effective. The National Council of State Housing Finance Agencies also has a series of best practices for state housing finance agencies to report data, and following those, I think, would also be an effective tool.
Okay. Mr. Calabria, you expressed concern that this tax credit is too focused on large multi-unit structures in urban areas. In my home state of Iowa, we have many small towns and rural communities that are sorely in need of housing. In fact, I don't know how many times I hear this when I'm going around my county meetings, particularly from employers that are looking for more employees, and housing is an impediment. How could the tax credit be improved to better serve the needs of suburban and rural communities?
A great question, Senators. And I mentioned about half of renters live in properties with under 5 units. So again, the average tax credit is about 40 units. So one option would, of course, be to set aside for a certain number of units. You could require that a third of tax credit volume, dollar volume, go to either units under 20 or 10. I mean, this is certainly something where you can look at where the touch point is. But I think ultimately, and again, I don't want to dismiss the efforts that housing finance agencies are taking, but I think at this point, having a set aside for smaller properties is appropriate.
Mr. Watson, one recommendation you made to increase available housing and lower costs was to shorten the cost recovery period for residential structures. Specifically, you expressed support for providing neutral cost recovery. Can you elaborate on what you mean and how it would work?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. So under neutral cost recovery, it effectively is emulating providing the full value of the depreciation deduction for those types of investments. Because right now, when you make that investment and you have this deduction against your income, because you have that big expense, you have to take that over 27 and a half years. And both because of inflation and because the value of a dollar is higher now than it would be in the future, the real value of those deductions is eroded. Of course, we solve this through in other types of investments by just allowing folks to immediately expense those investments, as was done with the bonus depreciation measures adopted in 2017. That's really hard to do with structures, just given how large they are. And there's concern about, for example, we tried this in the early 80s, and there were some distortions in the market. Neutral cost recovery is a way to get around that by just allowing for an adjustment to preserve the real value of those deductions without needing to expense them. And that would, of course, increase the incentive to invest and preserve the value of those deductions over time.
Mr. Calabria, although there are housing shortages across the country, it's clear that some state and localities are doing worse than others. Governments in states like Iowa have encouraged development in construction sector. One town like Pella, Iowa, has gained national recognition for private efforts to increase housing availability. However, other areas have gone the other direction and increased barriers to building or renovating homes. Federal programs do have an impact, but it is ultimately these local decisions that have the greatest effect. What should state and local governments do to ensure that our federal housing programs are intended and bring down the cost of housing?
Great question, Senator, and I think we should commend those states that are making progress. I think just this week, Washington State, for instance, made a change, or at least the Senate made a change to its environmental approval process for housing. Obviously, Minnesota has made a number of changes. There have been great examples of where states have been leaders, and I think many other states should follow those examples.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you, Senator Grassley. Senator Cantwell. Senator Johnson would be next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Full disclosure, I'm not a real fan of using the tax code to socially and economically engineer. I think we oftentimes do far more harm than good. And I want to lay out an example in Milwaukee for Mr. Watson, because you kind of touched on this. There's a great program I visited a number of years ago called the ACTS, A-C-T-S housing program. They had an opportunity because there are all these homes built in the 20s, 30s, wonderful construction, but they're in foreclosure, and so this program could buy these homes literally for a few $1,000s, then working with the banks, making low interest loans available to low-income individuals, literally for $30,000, $40,000 they could renovate a home, put a lot of sweat equity in, and it worked great. I mean, they were cutting their rental payments from, by hundreds of dollars a month. It was a great program working. When I visited them a couple of years ago, they were complaining that these tax credits, federal tax credits, going in the pockets of developers were causing developers to dramatically increase the cost of that housing, and then it was going to more gentrified neighborhoods, and all of a sudden they couldn't buy these homes. It was really hampering a very successful program. So that's just one example. But I want to focus my questions on, I think, a statement Ms. Gino talked about, that we simply can't, the market simply can't supply low-cost housing. Why? I mean, again, I see the costs. You've got land, you got labor, you got construction. Let's go through that. I mean, for example, in Wisconsin, the average cost of a family home is somewhere around $250,000. With the trade wars, the cost of lumber was a year or so ago, $35,000 was the increase per new home construction. The lack of workers. So again, Mr. Calabria, can you just talk about those factors, what is government potentially doing, making impossible for the marketplace, which should not be impossible?
I very much share your frustration, Senator. Let's set aside the number of households who would have zero or near zero income who can't afford anything, and we'll come back to them. But the reason the market is not filling the needs of affordable housing is because we aren't letting it. And we need to remove those barriers predominantly at the state and local level, some at the federal level. And then for those households who cannot afford it because their income is zero or near zero, we should do.
So again, let's zero into those barriers. I mean, how much do we drive up construction costs by all of the environmental regulations we put on products? Drive up the cost of a washing machine or a range or whatever. What again, the trade wars and driving up the price of lumber. Can you, specifically talk about what government, how government drives up the cost of every component in construction?
So a recent National Association of Home Builders study, I think done in association with Sharon's organization, found that the cost of regulation was about 40% of the cost of development of multifamily. Personally, I think that's probably an underestimate in terms of taking in zoning into account. But we can see this.
So put that in dollar terms, 40%. So if a standard multi is $1 million, I mean, that's $400,000 added cost that wouldn't have to be there. Now, some of those regulations may be necessary. Maybe the cost is some. I'm not sure all.
I mean, I think a good way of looking at this is we can see very similar units in places like Texas that are built for $200,000 that in places like California may even approach $1 million, as you mentioned. So there are places where we've shown you can build housing, you can build it affordably, you can be accessible. We know how to do this.
So again, just for ease of calculation, let's say $1 million piece of property. If the cost regulation is $40,000, what is the benefit of a tax credit, Mr. Watson?
Clearly the low-income housing tax credit and these other credits are just offsetting some of this, added regulatory
That's the point I'm trying to make here.
Overall.
We're a dog chasing its tail.
Exactly.
We're causing the problem, driving up the cost by 40%, and then we're offering what percent relief from that burden? That's the question I'm asking. Can you put a percentage to it?
I'm not sure if there's a strict percentage, but I think I think you mentioned this, is not only is it the regulatory and these other costs, material costs, but we really shouldn't be adopting policies that magnify that. I think you mentioned the trade war being one, and others that are just going to erode the value of the credit. And I think the zoning issue is really important too, because to the extent, I think Dr. Calabria said this, that supply is constrained, that may actually magnify the amount of the benefit that's just going to the developers and not to those low-income
So it's extremely important to put numbers to this so we can understand the root cause. So again, we're not chasing our tails. And again, the root cause is regulation increasing this, trade wars, a worker shortage. We need to focus all that. And by the way, a simpler and more rational tax code would also reduce costs for people as well. So rather than make it more complex, add another barnacle onto the ship of state, slow it down even further, we ought to talk about scraping the barnacles off. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Senator Johnson. Senator Carper's next.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, one and all. Welcome to Delaware. So, there's an outpost here. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for your interest in housing people in this country. I'm a recovering governor. Some of my colleagues are also recovering governors. And when I was governor, we've created something called the Family Services Cabinet Council, which is about 7 different departments of state government that focused on helping families, strengthening families. And one of those was our State Housing Authority. We focused for 8 years on trying to make home ownership a priority and a possibility for all kinds of people. I think when I stepped down as governor, we may have been in terms of the level of home ownership in our I think we might have been the #1. And I'm very, very, very proud of that. There's a verse of scripture in the Bible, I think it's in Matthew, about when I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was naked, did you clothe me? When I was thirsty, did you give me to drink? When I was a stranger in your land, did you welcome me? It doesn't say anything about when I didn't have a house to live in, or I was living in somebody's apartment, or I was living under a bridge or in a car. But I think the inference is the same, did we do anything about it? And it's not just on the federal government. It's not just our responsibility. It's not just on state governments or county or local governments. It's not just the nonprofits. It's not just the church community. It's really all of us. This is a team sport and a shared responsibility. And part of that responsibility is ours. And everything I do, everything we do, I know we can do better. The Constitution of our country, which Delaware was the first state to ratify, starts off with a preamble that says, "We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union," that's what it says, "we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union." And our founding fathers knew that everything we do, everything they did, we could do better, and we know the same is true today. So hopefully this hearing today, and I commend our chair and ranking member for pulling us together. This is a topic that's a mind for me and a whole lot of folks that I represent and others, my colleagues, do. I think in Delaware, we made a fair amount of progress in recent years, including investing some $78 million from the American Rescue Plan to invest in affordable housing. And while these investments are a big step forward, I continue to hear from communities in Delaware and actually outside of Delaware that need us to do a bit more. And I'm encouraged that there's bipartisan support on this committee, as there is on many issues, to tackle this challenge. I often tell my state that we ought to figure out what works, do more of that. When I was governor, I was chair of the National Governors Association. We had an entity within the NGA called Center for Best Practices. We used to share ideas with one another, steal ideas from other states that worked. Fortunately, we have a number of proven tools to address those challenges, including tax incentives, including grants and other financing options. And these tools often complement each other, working hand in glove to support new housing construction. I got a question for, and I hope I don't screw up your name, Wilson. How do you pronounce your last name? Gino? Gino, very good. Has your name ever been mispronounced?
Just once or twice.
Okay. How about today? No, hopefully not. And you, Ms. Gino, and also Ms. Scott. Ready? Okay. What are some of the existing gaps in financing that hold back the development of affordable housing? And what types of federal investments will give us the best, if you will, bang for our bucks to address this challenge? Ms. Scott, you want to go first?
Sure. Thank you, Senator.
Where are you from, Ms. Scott?
New York.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Good.
Not far from you.
Good. That's true.
In terms of the gaps, I think the biggest gap we've talked about it is our inability to achieve affordability across a broader spectrum of people, and that the range of families that are experiencing affordability is growing. And so all of the housing programs, the tax programs, and the other housing programs that exist that provide for subsidies, for tax credits, and all of that are necessary. But in addition to everything, we also have the growing concern today about the rising cost of construction, the cost of labor. You've heard the list of things. And so I think that what we need to do is to find ways to really increase the value of the credit and make sure that we can really reach more households. I think the best programs have already the low-income housing tax credit, the CDBG and home, and a host of other programs like that are providing the kind of resources we need. It's just that the scale of the problem is growing, and so we end up with the gaps that we're talking about in our ability to achieve the greater outcomes that we're looking for.
All right, thank you. Ms. Gino, please, same question.
No, again, I agree with Ms. Scott's response. I've been at this for 30 years, and I wish we had found the magic bullet already, but we haven't. We need every...
Would that be since birth?
Hardly, but we need every tool in the toolbox and more of it. And from your experience as governor, I'm sure you encountered all markets are different, even within the smaller state of Delaware. A number of the housing markets are different. So the ability to have different tools, both subsidy tools as well as tax tools, as well as, to Dr. Calabria's point, the ability to be flexible about local and state regulation. All those things need to be available, and we need to piece them together in different communities to make them work for people that need housing.
All right, good. Mr. Chairman, my time's expired. Can I have like 15 seconds to just mention one other thing? One of the things we did in Delaware when I was privileged to be governor is we, in our state housing authority, we said that for folks who were on welfare and went to work and started making money, that they did not have to pay taxes on the beginning of their earnings. And that went into a separate fund. They could use that money for down payments on either an apartment to move into or a house to buy. So that's just one of many ideas that I think is worth pursuing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator
Thank
Carper.
you all.
Out today with a very good proposal, Senator Cardin with Senator Young.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I just really want to underscore the point that we do not have enough stock for affordable housing. supply and demand issues. It's just not affordable. So I first want to thank you. I want to thank Senator Young and Senator Cantwell on the low-income housing tax credit. It's an extremely important tool. It's the strongest tool we have to date. And in and of itself, it's not enough. So it's usually combined with historic tax credits or some other stakeholders' investments in order to move forward with an affordable housing plan in our community. So I know in Maryland, we've been able to use the low-income housing tax credits, the historic tax credits. We've had philanthropic help, all the nonprofit community, all combined in order to deal with affordable housing in our community. But one of the things we could do is try to preserve communities so that we can maintain affordable housing that's commensurate with the income of the people that live in that community. And that's been a challenge. That's why I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank Senator Young in regards to the introduction of the Neighborhood Home Improvement Act, because it's aimed at that area where we have strong neighborhoods. We have the income of that neighborhood, the people that live there, are not adequate in order to renovate or to construct or to buy homes in that community. So the Neighborhood Home Investment Act is aimed at dealing with that. So, Mrs. Scott, if I might, I'm going to start with you. Tell me how you think such an appraisal gap credit can help in regards to maintaining the strength of communities and dealing with the wealth gap that we have here in America.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you for your sponsorship of neighborhood homes. The bottom line is that in the communities that we're talking about, the cost to build far exceeds the value in the market, and so there's just no way to get at building these homes without addressing the gap. And so the credit enables us to do that. This credit will enable us to probably build around construct and rehab about 500,000 homes over the next decade. That's a big deal in these communities where lower income families will benefit, both urban and rural communities. And many of these neighborhoods are already suffering from the blight of vacancy and dilapidated homes. So it will go a long way to improve conditions in the neighborhood. We estimate about $125 billion of total development activity. That's going to help in terms of local economy, $26 billion in federal tax revenue, and another $12 billion in state and local government revenue. So this credit is going to spur the market and then generate revenue, tax revenue across the layers of government.
I thank you for that. I'll talk a little bit about the wealth gap, because home ownership is one of the areas that we deal with trying to reduce the wealth gap in this country. Tell us how home ownership can help us deal with the wealth gap and preserving communities.
Right. Well, as we know, that housing is the primary source of wealth building for generations, and for many of the families who cannot afford a home, they don't have any other opportunity unless you own a business in order to generate wealth. So enabling first-time home buyers, first-generation home buyers, many of whom are in Black and Latin communities. The tax credit is really aimed at the census tracts that in many cases are majority minority communities. And so it'll also attract, we believe, families from those census tracts who would benefit from this credit and be able to buy a home.
I want to move to a second subject, which deals with the urgency of action by Congress, and I appreciate so many of my colleagues that have legislation here. I can tell you the waiting lists in Maryland are long for affordable housing. The options are not really bright today. So just any of them, one on the panel, talk a little bit about the urgency of us dealing with these issues. We missed an opportunity in the last Congress. How urgent is it for Congress to strengthen the tools?
I'm happy to take that on, Senator. Again, coming out of COVID, we really put a spotlight on the importance of housing for health and for all sorts of other outcomes. People are still struggling now, and it takes a long time to put these deals together. I worked on them for many years as a lawyer myself. You have to start today in order to get housing. Frankly, if you enacted this bill today, it would take 3, 4, 5 years to truly see the housing on the ground to serve residents. We know we're already falling behind. So if we don't act very quickly to bring more resources to the table, we're going to fall even further behind in the future. And the population of our nation is still growing. We are anticipating we're at 330, 340 million Americans today. We're going to be at 400 million Americans by the middle of this century. They all need to live somewhere. So we really need to start this now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Tillis is next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. I hope you're not as cold as I am, but I suspect a couple of you are. Mark, it's good to see you. I thank you for the work you did at HFHA, and I appreciate you being here today. I had the opportunity to really start getting my understanding of what you need to do to build affordable housing back in my time in the State House, and we made some progress. The progress we made there was always balanced between tax incentives, but also a very healthy focus on impediments to affordable housing. First among them are regulations. I remember vividly a town in my legislative district spent 45 minutes of an hour-long meeting talking about affordable housing, and then they shifted to agenda item 2. And it was to authorize their local government to mandate sprinkler systems in all single-family dwellings. I said, guys, we just spent 45 minutes talking about affordable housing, and you've just proposed something that would increase the cost of an affordable home by 10 to 15%. How do those work? Okay. So that didn't happen. But when we're talking about, and I think the chairman in this committee has a lot of opportunities for proposals in the last Congress to come together and really make headway here. But I, for one, think if we want a good, strong, bipartisan, bicameral outcome, we have to get to the point that there are regulations that are either outdated or need to be modernized. To what extent, and Mr. Watson, I want you to opine on this, anyone can, to what extent do we think, Dr. Calabria, we need to have that balanced approach for anything we do here? If we just do tax incentives, are we really doing something that's going to provide a sustainable long-term opportunity for people in the affordable housing space?
Yeah, I was just going to add that I think that part of this is there is a major risk that you're effectively pushing on a string if you only rely on tax credits, because it's similar to what was mentioned earlier. If you have regulations, if you have zoning restrictions, if you have other barriers, there's a higher risk that a lot of those credits will be.
I'll give you another example. I want y'all to continue to answer. I want to keep in my time, but I'll give you another example. The more recent promulgation of WOTUS is far better than where it started. But I talked to bipartisan groups of county commissioners, most recently over the last month, who say that's going to be a real problem for development. And if you think about the development of certain properties, it may even be disproportionately so for ones that would make projects work. But that's why, so I think I hear agreement here. If we want something that we're not coming back every Congress and having the same discussion, we need to come up with a more rational, sustainable framework. And I think in that requires a look at regulations, not to get rid of them. You want them to be safe. You want them to be environmentally sound. But I think there's a lot of work we can do there. One question, and Dr. Calabria, do you have something to add?
I was going to say part of the process is just getting, certainty. You often, I mean, the worst example of this may be the environmental review process in California, where you can be fully entitled to the land, you can be zoned, you can have all of these things set up, and then you're years after years of being litigated. And so, again, we can debate what the right zoning should be for a certain area. We can debate how to protect the environment. But I think what developers need most is knowing there's a light at the end of the tunnel.
Right. And I, for one, think that federal funding and federal support should go to the jurisdictions that have proven responsibility on regulatory execution. We're not going to have enough money to address it nationally. So if certain states and local jurisdictions want to overregulate and make the barriers to affordable housing high, then until we have all the money that we need for everybody who requests it, we should put a priority on jurisdictions that are getting it right, managing all the right outcomes for safety, health, but getting it right. And I already see with the CHIPS Act, I voted for the CHIPS Act, $52 billion. Now we've got guidance put out by the Department of Labor that's going to discount that $52 billion by a double-digit percentage because of structural costs. Those are the things we needed to avoid when we get to a bipartisan outcome here, and I think we will. Mr. Watson, if you could just tell me a little bit about LIHTC and how we can do a better job of balancing urban and rural areas. I'm a 50-50 state. I got the problems of big cities and the problems of rural areas. What do we need to do there? Thank you.
Yeah, I would echo a lot of what Dr. Calabria said earlier about how that we need to create incentives for push for providing LIHTC for smaller unit sizes, which can be more accommodating to rural areas. I think that would be helpful. Going back to the data side of things, I think if we get more information either from HUD or if they come in and become more of an active participant in some of these things, that would also help us understand where those disparities may lie across different localities. I think it's a really great suggestion made earlier to try to bring in state FHAs and others who may have that data and information so that we can come to some conclusions about what the right policy recommendations are to help rural areas.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Tillis, before you go, I'm very interested in your ideas for cleaning out needless red tape and just, bureaucratic, water torture almost. I mean, it just goes on and on. The challenge, of course, is nobody wants federal zoning. In other words, nobody wants to say, hey, let's write a whole bunch of rules for America here.
Nor do I.
Yeah, obviously. Nobody wants to go there, so I look forward to your ideas and suggestions.
Thank you.
Okay, Senator Hassan's next.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and to you and Ranking Member Crapo. Thank you for holding this hearing, and thanks to all the witnesses for being here. Ms. Gino, I want to start with a question for you. In New Hampshire, I hear from families about the burden that rising housing costs have had on their ability to live and work in our state. And it also obviously hurts businesses. The story I am hearing repeatedly right now is we've made an offer to a really valuable recruit to come into the state and work for our business, and they not only can't afford a place to live, they can't find a place, even if they could afford it. So part of the reason that we're seeing rising housing costs in New Hampshire and around the country is obviously a lack of supply. And that's why additional federal support for programs to support housing construction, like the low-income housing tax credit, is critical. Can you discuss how states can use programs like the low-income housing tax credit to address the shortage of workforce housing?
Sure. We talked earlier about the MyTech proposal that Chairman Wyden has introduced, and that really is an important tool to really capture that group that doesn't qualify for the low-income housing tax credit, is trying to move up the economic scale. However, their wages are not keeping pace with the increased cost of housing. Again, housing isn't the only sector of our economy that has experienced incredible cost increases, particularly since COVID. Food, energy, other sectors as well. We've seen those more in real time because they're implemented pretty quickly when those cost increases go up. In the housing sector, however, it's much more of a lagging indicator, particularly in the rental side, particularly in part because people sign one-year leases, they get renewed at different times. So those costs from COVID are really just hitting our sector right now. So we need as many tools in the toolbox as we can to develop increased supply in communities, both suburban, urban, and rural.
Well, thank you. And I want to turn to the issue of rural housing now. And Ms. Scott, I have a question for you, and I know Senator Grassley, and I just heard Senator Tillis talk a little bit about it too. Ms. Scott, in your testimony, you note that investments in quality housing not only supports families, but also strengthens the economy and supports employment. I hear from constituents all across my state, including those in rural areas like our North Country, that expanding housing options is necessary to expand economic opportunity. How can we leverage the tax code and expand existing federal housing programs to help make housing more affordable for rural families?
Thank you, Senator, for that question. For one, we can provide a basis boost for the projects in rural communities. This would go a long way to help deals pencil out that currently do not. We can align the income limit requirements. There's a difference between the income limit requirements to rural communities between the housing credit and the private activity bonds, and that difference leads to also a gap in terms of how we can finance. And then lastly, I would say that providing the basis boost for projects serving Native communities would also help in terms of we should require states, I think, to provide a selection preference that allows more projects to serve Native communities. When you combine sort of fixes like that, I think we begin to get to addressing some of the gaps in providing housing in both rural communities and Native communities and the like.
That's very helpful. Thank you. An additional question for you, Ms. Scott. In addition to increasing the supply of housing, it's essential that we provide additional support for families working to achieve home ownership. That's why last Congress I introduced bipartisan legislation which was called the Middle Class Mortgage Insurance Premium Act to provide tax cuts for middle-class homebuyers who use mortgage insurance. Can you discuss how mortgage insurance can make home ownership more accessible, and how else can we continue to cut housing costs for families?
Sure. The issue there is that home buyers who can't afford the 20% down payment are required to purchase mortgage insurance, and that requirement prohibits a lot of families from actually going forward with home ownership. So for first-time home buyers, minority home buyers, those are the ones that we really, really want to focus on. And I think that, as noted earlier in the testimony, the gaps in terms of their the limit in income and the limits in savings, this will help us to address that gap and make it more available, make homeownership more available to many more families. This is also why we support increasing funding to other housing programs that can provide down payment assistance as well, like, for example, CDBG and Home and the USDA Rural Housing Services single-family programs. So we say combining all of those other resources to increase the availability of home ownership down payment assistance.
Well, thank you very much. That's very helpful, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank my colleague. Here's where we are. I'm going to run and vote and then free Senator Crapo up. And I do have a family commitment at noon that I can't break. So we'll go with Senator Cantwell, and then we'll go with Senator Young. With a little bit of luck, others will come in after they vote. But it's going to be a little bit of a juggling act, and Senator Crapo and I will call some audibles. Senator Cantwell.
Did my colleague Senator Young wanted to go?
I'm prepared to. Thank you. Thank you, Senator Cantwell.
I'm yielding to my...
I'm grateful for that.
My colleague who is working so diligently with me to get an increase in the tax credit.
Thank you to the great senator from the state of Washington with Hoosier roots. I appreciate that. Well, I mean, this is a timely hearing, and I've enjoyed working with Senator Cantwell and others, and I look forward to working with the ranking member on housing affordability challenges. I dare say we're in the midst of a national crisis right now. I mean, we've experienced consumer inflation across a number of areas in the economy in recent years, but this is one that really, going back to when I entered the U.S. House of Representatives in 2011, as I travel around the state of Indiana, I've heard a lot about housing affordability. Tried to trace the roots and primary drivers of this challenge, and it's manifold. It's labor challenges. It's many contractors went out of business during the financial crisis a number of years ago. Still haven't come back. Oftentimes we have input challenges, on and on and on. But by any stretch, this is a market failure. Yes, I use the term deliberately, but I also use it carefully. After a study, it's pretty clear we have a market failure, some of which has been a result of government failures or government excesses, whether it was through the over-subsidization of mortgages or zoning or land use policies over the years, but in the end, the market hasn't worked. So we can do that, I think, in some instances by at the very least shining a light on some of the government policies that distort markets and make housing, affordable housing, out of reach for some people. And I try to do that through my YIMBY Act, which through a light touch approach would require localities to make clear when they are implementing land use and zoning policies which historically exclude certain peoples and or drive up the cost of housing. So that's a priority. But what I'm most excited about today, and I know all of you want to hear about this, are some things that I am working on with my good friend from the state of Maryland, Senator Cardin. We have introduced legislation we are calling the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act. Now, this is a reintroduction. Senator Portman collaborated with Senator Cardin on this legislation, but it would address the value gap between the cost of renovating a house and the market price in low-income census tracts. So if you go through any major city in the United States, many small towns, we will see what is loosely called blight, unsightly homes. And I've traveled around these neighborhoods, tried to figure out how we can make it economical to remove these homes, to allow others to put homes in their place or to renovate those structures. And Senators Portman and Cardin were able to crack that nut, and I'm carrying the ball this Congress. The NHIA will not only increase access to affordable housing, it will also increase jobs and provide economic development around the country. The estimated impact of this bill over 10 years in the state of Indiana alone is remarkable. Approximately 9,500 homes will be built or substantially rehabilitated. About $2.5 billion of total development activity will occur, state of Indiana alone, over 10 years. Over 16,000 jobs in construction or construction-related industries will be created. Over $900 million in wages and salaries will be generated. Nearly $250 million in federal, state, and local tax revenues and fees will eventuate if we can get this done, as I think we will this Congress. So these are the sorts of things that I think we ought to be working on during a time of what is called divided government. But I see us coming together on important priorities like this that don't have a red or blue hue to them. And I thank all of you for being here much. I do want to recognize the Terwilliger, Ron, the Terwilliger Center and all the good work they do in the housing space. And I actually, I have with me today a letter that I would like to enter into the record. So I ask for unanimous consent to do so.
Without objection.
Okay. And we'll put that from the Good Housing Center in the record. And with that, I will just look forward to following up with our witnesses. Won't be asking any questions of you today. So with that, Mr. Ranking Member.
Senator Cantwell.
Thank you, Chair Crapo. Thank you so much. I wanted to go back to this workforce housing that I brought up, and I know some of my colleagues did, and that this workforce housing, I'm hearing that hospitals are paying for affordable housing, that insurance, I see nods, insurance are paying for affordable housing, that people are finding it's just better to build affordable housing than incur the cost of unhoused individuals. I also wondered if I could get people to comment on the fact that the LIHTC program is also so successful in rural areas that even while that may make sense in Seattle, that healthcare or insurance might pay for housing as a better way to deal with the population, that we're also seeing the need for affordable housing in rural economies, and that's why this legislation on increasing the tax credit is so important. And the fact that in 2018 we secured a bump that ran through 2021 but now is expired, and what impact that is having. So, Mr. Walker, do you want to start and try to address those issues?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Starting with the second one on the bump, you know, that juice the production at a very important time. And as we've seen over the last handful of years related to the pandemic, we now have lost that 12%, 12.5% increase at a time when costs have gone way, way up in a very short amount of time. So we're playing catch up. We're trying to fill gaps in a lot of financed deals that can't either get off the ground or get completed without some additional funding. So losing that 12.5% could not have happened at a worse time. On the second, on your first question about rural areas, as has been discussed, you know, rents are lower in rural areas, and the cost of materials is not much different. And so that creates a real a paradigm and a challenge for developing in those communities. And the credit program, especially the 9% program that has a much larger equity component to it, is so key to addressing the affordable housing needs that are equally large in our rural areas. I might also add what we are seeing sort of converging and colliding really is we need to produce new units, and as the credit program approaches 40 years old, we are also under a lot of pressure to get back to those older deals and preserve and do some rehabilitation and recapitalization work. So there are two pressures on every dollar of credit that we have available to us, both because of the success of the program and all the units that we have built, as well as the housing crisis that we are in right now and needing to produce additional units, both in rural areas as well as our urban areas.
And does anybody else, Mr. Calabria, I see you and others nodding your head. I mean, I still don't feel like we've calibrated this issue so that everybody gets it. It is a supply issue. We are not keeping pace with demand. And to your point, Mr. Walker, we literally had supply come out of the system because it went to market-based rates, you know, on pressure. So what should we do? Yes, Mr. Calabria or Mr. Walker.
Thank you. I mean, I will maybe take a little bit of different. Yes, the tax credit is used in rural and suburban areas, but certainly just looking at the distribution of the stock, it is still a heavily urban bias to the program. And again, as Mr. Walker alluded to, the economics of the program are harder in rural areas. That's absolutely true, and that's why I'm generally of the view that we probably should have a rural set aside in the program to nudge housing finance agencies to do the projects that are harder there.
Thank you. Mr. Walker?
Yeah, I just, you know, I don't think it's been acknowledged yet, and I think it's important to acknowledge that we have underbuilt for now 2+ decades, and we are in a deep, deep hole at a time when, you know, there's the wealth gap is widening, and so there is this is a multifaceted challenge, and I would not say that the credit program is perfect, but it is very good. And the Credit Improvement Act, in particular, when we think about rural areas, has a component of a basis boost in rural areas, and that is really going to close that's going to really help close the financing gap that presents itself in many of our rural areas.
How much have we underbuilt?
Boy, I don't know how to put a figure on that. I feel like we are in such a deep hole that, you know, just seeing the break-even point is really, really challenging. But I'd love to get back to you on that.
I've asked this question of other witnesses. I've heard 300,000 units. I've heard different numbers. I think people have admitted that the downturn basically just kind of put a halt to a lot of things. And those were significant years where supply was not, you know, meeting the market. And then we've had other issues. So anyway, I'd like to get this number because I think if we could show our colleagues exactly how much supply has not been put in the system, then, you know, these other issues, like you're saying, the pandemic and supply chains, we all know how much that increased cost of materials. And then you take out the one bump we were able to get. So yeah, there's probably like a huge swing in the amount of cost that are now making it more expensive. Again, tacked on to this decade plus where we didn't keep pace with supply. So it really, I mean, then you can really see why we're in this hole, and I think maybe will motivate people. I'm very interested in looking at the rural credit issue, so thank you.
Thank you. Senator Warren.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'm going to pick up actually where Senator Cantwell left off, and that is that for decades the country has underinvested in our housing supply, and the data I see suggests we're now facing a shortage of as many as 7 million affordable homes. But the bottom line is that we need more housing for everyone, for renters and first-time homebuyers and veterans and people living with disabilities and families experiencing homelessness, you name it, we need more housing. So tax policies can be a way to address housing shortages. The low-income housing tax credit is not perfect, but it helps drive the development of affordable rental homes. But some of our tax policies may actually make the problem worse. Wall Street money managers have fanned out across the country, buying and converting what little supply of affordable homes remain, and they get tax breaks to do that. Ms. Scott, you are an expert on community development, so let me start by asking you about the impact of more Wall Street investors moving into the housing market. Big corporate landlords, often acting through investment vehicles known as real estate investment trusts or REITs, have bought up hundreds of thousands of homes across our country over the past decade. Now, some of these folks argue that REITs and other investors encourage investment in supply and neighborhood quality. Is that what you've seen?
Thank you, Senator, for this focus and your question. We're not opposed to
make sure your mic's on.
Okay. We're not opposed to REITs per se, but we are very concerned about the institutional investors in the housing market and in our communities. We listed a research paper focusing in on New York City that you may have seen, that in certain instances when these investors acquire properties, they refinance them. So they're extracting money from the real estate and taking it out of the community rather than reinvesting it in the housing that they purchase. Oftentimes we find that the housing that has been purchased, the rents are increased, and there is the existing tenants may even lose their housing, they may be evicted. We see that maintenance, the quality of maintenance goes down, and overall there aren't the capital improvements. So, and on the single-family side, we see something similar happening where these investors are snapping up homes to rent at much higher rates than the market has generally supported. And so you see less opportunity for first-time home buyers. This is the stock, right? And so the community is being denied wealth. Wealth is coming out of the community, the housing is dilapidated, and oftentimes the institutional investors are not easily identified. And so it's not clear who the players are, where the money is coming from, and it's changing the face of many of our communities.
So that's a pretty grim picture about what's going on. And it's particularly alarming because in 2021, investors bought up 1/4 of all single-family homes that were on the market. And no surprise, the places where the biggest of these investors went, those that own thousands of properties, have been the places where home prices have increased the most. Now, these same biggest investors are collecting record profits while they are subsidized by government financing and tax breaks. So I just want to take a quick look at these tax breaks. Mr. Watson, we're going to be limited on time, so let's see if we can do these as true falses. You are an expert on federal tax policy at the Tax Foundation. Let's just talk about a few of the tax breaks that Wall Street investors have exploited to hoover up homes, make the supply crisis worse, and drive up costs for families. True or false? Many REITs are billion-dollar companies, including some of the biggest corporate landlords in the United States, Invitation Homes, American Homes for Rent, and Mid-America Apartments. But they generally do not pay corporate income tax if they meet certain conditions. Is that right? True or false?
If they deduct from their income, they would not.
True. Okay. So let's do another. The 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act allows investors to deduct 20% of their pass-through business income, such as dividends they might receive from REITs. True or false?
True.
True. All right, let's keep going here. I like the way you're doing this. The CARES Act allowed all business losses to be carried back for 5 years. True or false?
That's true.
That's true. And that change resulted in billions of dollars in tax benefits that went largely to the wealthiest in the country, including Wall Street real estate investors. So let's do one more. Real estate investors can avoid paying taxes on profits from the sale of property if those profits are used to buy another property, a process known as like-kind exchanges.
That's true.
True or false? Okay. This loophole is expected to provide investors with a $134 billion tax break over the next 10 years. You know, I just want to say here, our tax policies reward giant real estate investors who raise fees, jack up rents, and evict families. Americans are already suffering from a severe lack of affordable homes, and any taxpayer money spent on housing should go toward fixing the problem, not making it worse. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Warren, we'll have, because of her collegiality, we will have Senator Brown, then we'll have Senator Cortez Masto, and then we're going to wrap up because I have to deal with William Peter Wyden, age 15, in a couple of minutes. Okay, Senator Brown.
He must be a relative. Is he a relative?
Yeah, son.
I knew that. And Senator Cortez Masto, thank you for your graciousness. Dr. Calabria, good to see you again. Glad you're here. Thank you. Ms. Scott, in this committee and the Banking and Housing Committee, we've heard time after time how difficult it is for first-time home buyers and families to find a place they can afford. Yesterday, I joined Senators Cardin and Young and Wyden and Moran in reintroducing the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act. I know Senator Cardin and Senator Young raised this with you earlier. Ms. Scott, how would the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act help expand the supply of safe, affordable homes and open up home ownership opportunities for families in Ohio and across the country?
Thank you, Senator, for this question. Essentially, what the credit is going to do is to enable us to build housing because we'll be able to fill the gap between what it costs to build and what the home is actually valued at. In the communities that you're referring to, Ohio, for example, the value of the home is less than the cost of the construction. So once we close that gap, we get to a place where we can build more homes. We expect that we can build another 500,000 new homes under this program over the next 10 years, and that the program, the Neighborhood Homes Credit, is targeted to census tracts that will assist many low-income families and minority families, both in urban and rural communities.
Thank you. Mr. Walker, last Congress, I introduced the Bipartisan Housing for Homeless Students Act with Senators, my colleague from Ohio, Senator Portman, and Senator King of Maine. This bill ensures that students and veterans who have experienced homelessness are eligible to reside in low-income housing tax credit, LIHTC funding, affordable housing while pursuing an education full-time. Currently, these students are not eligible for LIHTC financed housing. This creates a catch-22 for students forced to choose, make an untenable choice between a roof over their heads and full-time status. What would it mean to students and veterans experiencing homelessness to be eligible for affordable housing through LIHTC while pursuing their education? And would streamlining the student rule also make LIHTC easier to use?
Thank you for the question, and thank you for your leadership on this issue. I think, the student rule is a concept of decades ago, and I think both the credit program my experience is that we can improve on that by opening up the housing that we are creating for students, whether they are homeless students or students of families that have experienced homelessness, or whether they're working families that are having to retool for industry changes. We've learned as we've gone, and both your legislation and the Credit Improvement Act includes some modifications to really reconcile the shortcomings of limiting access to the affordable housing we're creating from students.
Thank you. And back to you, Ms. Scott. I want to follow up a bit on Senator Warren's questions and comments. We've seen what institutional and out-of-state investors are doing to communities in Ohio and everywhere else. My office is inundated with complaints from Ohio renters, from local officials who see investors jacking up rents, filing eviction after eviction, letting homes fall apart to the point where they're uninhabitable. Your comment about costing more than it's worth is particularly incisive, I think. How are these investors affecting renters, aspiring homeowners in their communities? Talk a bit more about that, if you would.
So essentially what happens here is that especially on the single-family homeownership side, this housing is swept off of the market as a resource for first-time homebuyers, first-generation homebuyers. The prices, if they are on the market for sale, are at a much higher rate than the market can bear, than the families can pay. So we're basically losing inventory that's affordable in these markets, and then we're also having the negative impact of the inventory that stays as rental, that it's, as I said, dilapidated, oftentimes not kept up, and so it's a problem that crosses across multiple layers of the housing inventory.
Thank you. And
yeah.
one of my favorite religion philosophers, Rumi, once said, "In generosity and helping others, be like a river," and that's what Senator Cortez Masto is. So thank you for yielding for a moment.
And I thank my colleague who also is going back to the Banking Committee, but it is a committee that also works very extensively on housing issues. So we're very glad to be able to be partners. Senator Cortez Masto.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to everybody here. It is just appropriate we're having this conversation right across the way as a Chair of the Federal Reserve. This question I asked him about housing and the impact the Federal Reserve is having on access to housing. Mr. Walker, let me start with you, and thank you for including your support of my bill, the Affordable Housing Bond Enhancement Act, in your opening statement. This legislation that I've introduced will expand the supply of affordable homes and improve access to home ownership for low and moderate income homebuyers, and improves our mortgage revenue bonds and mortgage credit certificate programs. Among other things, it raises the home improvement limit from $15,000 to $50,000, allows refinancing, simplifies the mortgage credit certificate calculation. So my question to you, Mr. Walker, is how would this legislation help working families buy and sustain home ownership?
Well, today's marketplace emphasizes the importance of mortgage revenue bonds, mortgage credit certificates, by being able to provide lower cost of borrowing and getting folks that otherwise would not have the access to the dream of home ownership. And so both of these tools are incredibly valuable, and I think your legislation helps to enhance these tools. Secondly, on the being able to improve homes, keeping people housed, people that have the opportunity to own a home but are struggling to maintain that home is an important component as well. And so whether it's an elderly couple that needs to do some modifications to their existing home so that they can age in place, again, very important component of our housing continuum.
And thank you, and I appreciate it. And I so appreciate the chairman and ranking member having this hearing, because there are a number of things that we have introduced that can help not only the home building side and the financing to pencil out, but on the home ownership and help those who want to access. And I'm hopeful after this we do have this group of bills that we're putting forward that really are going to make a difference here. I hear it in Nevada so often because we have an affordable housing issue on so many levels. Let me, Dr. Calabria, it's good to see you again. Thank you. Congratulations on your new book.
Thank you.
That has come out. I look forward to reading it. Let me ask you this, and thank you for serving as the FHFA director. In my research on the federal home loan banks, it has become clear that the federal home loan banks have access to the type of financing that affordable housing developers need. Acquisition, construction, long-term low fixed interest rates to finance multifamily housing developments. Yet this trillion-dollar system invested less than $3 billion in these types of investments, a fraction of the more than $300 billion in advances. And I think the FHL bank's advances could work very well with the low-income housing tax credit. I'm a supporter of the legislation there, and so many other ways. So my question to you is, Right now, the FHFA is taking a review of these federal home loan banks. And I'm curious, as a former director, your thoughts on that, appropriate? And then what should Congress be doing once the review is finalized?
Certainly appropriate. I had actually started my own internal review on some of the Bank Act questions when I was there. And it's been almost 30 years since Congress made any real changes to the federal home loan bank system. So I think in a couple of months we'll see a report from the agency to Congress. Some of that will include congressional recommendations. Maybe Senator Brown left, but maybe he's still listening when we can suggest that perhaps the Banking Committee should have some hearings on the system and look into it. But absolutely appropriate and timely.
Thank you. And for this reason, I've heard it from so many in my state around not just helping the homeowners, but this idea of putting together this financing. And I'm going to quote one of my state senators, it's like lasagna. You got to pull all these different pieces together to make it work, and each time it's going to come out maybe a little bit differently. Our goal here is to give them enough tools to put that lasagna, the ingredients that they need for that financing. There's so many different ways, and this is one of them. The Federal Home Loan Bank is an important part of it. I'm going to add one other thing that came up today, and I think it was Dr. Calabria that said this. In the West, majority of the land is owned by the federal government. So our local governments do not have the opportunity who own land to say, maybe we're going to provide this land at a cheaper rate for affordable housing. We have to go through the federal government to do so. There has to be a benefit, a work for those of us, and believe me, there's bipartisan support for this, to identify federal land in the West that can go for a cheaper rate to help us develop this affordable housing so it pencils out. So I'm just going to put that word out there. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And I thank my colleague, and I think, because I'm going to have to run, and Senator Menendez is going to wrap up, and I thank him for doing so. Senator Cortez Masto, as is usually the case, makes the point. The ingredients are there. And to me, we've had a lot of good ideas here. I think there's a chance to build a really unique coalition here to deal with this. The only thing that's unacceptable to me is for this Congress to take a pass on housing. This is too urgent. It's too important for all the reasons we've been talking about. Senator Menendez, thank you for making it possible to wrap up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and your closing statement there is exactly my sentiment, so thank you very much. Allowing property taxes to be fully deducted has been a bedrock principle of our tax code. It rewards states that provide services like education, public safety, transportation that improve the quality of life. The state and local tax deduction has been critical in ensuring housing stays affordable. Ms. Gino, your members that are C corporations are able to fully deduct state and local taxes at the entity level against their corporate taxable income. Is that correct?
Yes.
If SALT was capped for these corporations, wouldn't that likely increase the cost for tenants?
It could. And again, there's so many things that can be done on the state and local level to support, particularly from a tax policy perspective. We're seeing state and local taxes increase dramatically in communities across the country, and that is an increasing problem that impedes multifamily development. Another thing that state and local governments can do, and the federal government can help incentivize, is for them to provide tax abatement opportunities for multifamily housing development, particularly those that include affordable units. That by itself, again, federal incentives for state and local governments to make those changes on the local level would truly help. We've seen that happen in certain communities across the country. More of that would be beneficial.
Well, I appreciate that. I mean, unfortunately, what you described as a possibility is the unfortunate reality for middle-class homeowners in my state and many others. The 2017 Republican tax law gutted this essential deduction, not for large corporations, but for families, forcing them to be double taxed and punishing states with progressive tax codes that choose to invest in their communities. You know, New Jersey has some of the best schools in the nation. It has a vast infrastructure system in terms of transportation. These are all elements that make it a desirable state to live in. Of course, you spend money in those investments, and gutting the state and local property taxes has been a consequence that attacks the very essence about making those investments. Even if you have an abatement obviously forgoes a certain revenue at the municipal level. So the deduction would be able to help towards creating stability. And it has been essential for encouraging and preserving home ownership and wealth for Black and Hispanic homeowners. Historians like Andrew Call at the University of Virginia have found Black and Hispanic households have been subject to higher property tax assessments than their white counterparts. The SALT deduction has been vital in providing relief from unjust tax assessments, which is why the NAACP passed a resolution in support of lifting the cap. So I'm going to continue to revisit this issue until we get it right. Now, one of the greatest challenges in the current housing market, I know there's been a lot of talk about LIHTC, but I just want to add my voice to it. There's simply not enough affordable rental homes being built. And according to Secretary Fudge, even before the pandemic, we had a shortfall of 7 million affordable homes for low-income renters. So as a nation, we have to find ways to build more affordable homes, and part of that solution should come from our new investments. But we also need to make maximally effective use of existing tools, such as the bipartisan low-income housing tax credit, which subsidizes the creation of 100,000 units of affordable housing a year. But I think it has the potential to do even more. Ms. Gino, what would it mean for the development of new multifamily buildings if Congress increased LIHTC's value and total amount of credits as outlined in the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act?
Current estimates are that it would increase the value of the tax credit to create almost 2 million new homes.
2 million.
But again, as we stated earlier, we have to start today. There is a real urgency in moving this legislation forward. We are already losing ground. And if this legislation were passed today, it would take 3 years to see the benefit of that. So we need those additional 2 million homes, but it's going to take a minute to get there.
Now, tax credits like LIHTC are vital in increasing the supply of affordable housing, but developers first need to obtain financing to start construction and build homes. So institutions like community development financial institutions that deliver capital to communities where affordable housing is most needed, in my view, is a critical element of the housing ecosystem. Ms. Scott, can you talk about how CDFIs like yours support the development of affordable housing in underserved communities?
Yes, Senator, thank you for this focus. The most important thing I think that the CDFIs are doing is really providing capital at the early stage of development when it's almost impossible to get pre-development funding to even start a project and conceive of it. The CDFIs are lending. We're taking some of the biggest risk in the continuum of building housing, and it gets us to a place where developers can apply for credits and secure them, and then oftentimes are even coming back for some financing from us in order to work alongside the credit and other financing. We're also sometimes filling gaps in terms of the timeline, sometimes to preserve the integrity of the credit. We'll enter the tax credit deal before the credit flows, and that's another opportunity that enables a deal to go forward. We're also lending to borrowers, to developers that may not be able to secure conventional lending, and so that's another source of opportunity. So I think the CDFI world is really providing a real resource that's really helped to spur. I don't know the exact number of the percentage of low-income housing tax credits that have been built by CDFIs or helped to be built by CDFIs, but that number is substantial. Without the CDFI community, I don't think we would see as much housing, affordable housing production as we see now.
Well, that's why you have a proven track record of delivering affordable housing development in underserved communities, which is why I led the effort to establish the CDFI Bond Guarantee Program, which enables CDFIs to execute large-scale development projects. Would you, this is my final question, would you agree that expanded funding for CDFIs would help expand the building of affordable housing in places where it's needed the most?
Simply put, Senator, yes.
Okay. Sometimes yes is the strongest word. So I urge my colleagues to join me in strongly supporting funding for CDFIs as we deal with the 2024 appropriations. With that, on behalf of the chairman and the ranking member, thanks to all of you for your presence and information. For information of members, questions for the record will be due at 5 p.m. next Tuesday, March 14th. And with that, this hearing is adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.